Hi everyone, welcome to our quarterly webinar with Debra Band. Deborah, I'm so glad to be doing this webinar with you again.
So am I.
So tonight we're going to be talking about Deborah the prophetess, and Deborah's going to be talking about her work specifically with Arise, Arise, which is one of her illuminated manuscripts that looks at the story of Deborah the prophetess. Just to give a little bit of context, some of you are returning viewers. You come for all of our quarterly webinars with Deborah and perhaps for all of our webinars. But just to give you just a brief overview of JOFA and what we do, we're the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, and we are here to advocate on behalf of women in the Orthodox community and expand opportunities for women when it comes to ritual life, synagogue life, professional life, family life. And we have a number of platforms that we use for our programs. We have our blog that's hosted on the Jewish Week. We do monthly webinars. We do online panel conversations. You can follow us on Facebook. And we often do in-person events as well. A little bit about JOFA. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Debra Band and the incredible work she does. Deborah holds a BA in history from Concordia University in Montreal and an MS in political science from MIT. And she turned her full attention to Hebrew manuscripts in 1987. In her work, she draws on both her love of manuscripts and the arts and in biblical studies. And she has an incredible ability to partner its intellectual, spiritual depth with visual beauty. And she's used those talents in a number of works. She's done work on Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. I believe that was your most recent work. Oh no,
that was the first. The Kabbalat Shabbat book was most recent.
Right. The Kabbalat Shabbat. That's our last webinar that we did together. We looked at some of those manuscripts. So she's done work on Shir HaShirim. She's done work on Kabbalat Shabbat. And she's done work on Deborah the prophetess and some of the other Megillot. So at this point, I'm gonna turn it over to Deborah, and I will be off on the side navigating some of the slides while you watch.
Lovely. Thanks, Shira. This is great fun to be with you all tonight. So in Synagogue La Shabbat, which was both Tu B'Shvat and Shabbat Shira, we read the tales of two great formative miracles for the Jewish people, each of which includes a great victory song. First, in the Torah reading, the crossing of the Red Sea with the Song of the Sea, and in the Haftarah, Deborah's tale of leading the nascent nation through a war involving another water miracle and celebrated in the great Song of Deborah. Now, I discussed the Deborah story, the 4th and 5th chapters of Shoftim, the book of Judges, in a JOFA webinar last winter. But right now, this year, I'd like to use the confluence of Tu B'Shvat and Shabbat Shira as an excuse to focus on a couple of specific aspects of Deborah's story and what it teaches us about the importance of women's participation in the leadership of the Jewish community. We're going to explore what prophecy meant in very early Israel, examine the linkage of Deborah's prophecy, her wisdom, the relationship of these qualities with the welfare of the land, and by extension, the welfare of Klal Yisrael, the whole nation of Israel, wherever we're planted. Throughout, we're going to be looking at the illuminated paintings of the Deborah story that I did, as Shira said, for my book, Arise, Arise, Deborah, Ruth and Hannah. And we'll also illustrate some related ideas with paintings from my most recent book, Kabbalat Shabbat, The Grand Unification. Before I go any farther, I need to thank Sharon and Steve Lieberman, who supported bringing both of these works to light. And I should also add that a selection of the Kabbalat Shabbat paintings, the originals, are on exhibit now through May at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, if you'd like to visit. And now that I'm thinking about it, there's an exhibit of prints of some of the Kabbalat Shabbat paintings on at Hebrew College in Boston. So go take a look if you're nearby. We're going to move into Deborah's story in a moment, but first, let's think about Tu B'Shvat just a little bit. So Tu B'Shvat, which is the 15th of the month of Shvat, the new year of the trees, is not a biblical holiday, but rather a rabbinically ordained one, whose roots have to do with figuring out the schedule for tithing the fruits of trees based on the rainy season and different trees' fruiting times during the year. Now, many of our traditions have Tu B'Shvat Seders, ceremonies for enjoying the fruits of the trees that are traditionally associated with Israeli agriculture. And by extension, Tu B'Shvat is often considered a celebration of all the bounty of the land, occurring in the midst of the winter rainy season, celebration of the reinvigoration of the land itself and the sustenance of all Israel. The care of the land is a paramount concern in Tanakh. And when we read between the lines, we understand that an awareness of the natural environment, in particular the rainy cycle, is at the root of Deborah's story, her leadership of the people. So saddle up your donkey and let's get moving. Shira, can we have the next slide, please?
Sure.
Actually, the one after that. There we go. Okay. So here's the scene near the foot of Mount Tabor. Now, archaeologists have found remains of battles during the same time period as the Deborah story at Tanakh and Megiddo, which are just to the west of this spot. Now, Deborah's story is all about a battle in which a bunch of farmers and herders took on and defeated a heavy, technologically advanced standing army, where no less those farmers were led by a woman. Now, in the context of the period in which it was recorded, probably during the early monarchy, quite possibly recorded by Samuel, the tale's place in Shoftim, which, like it or not, is a catalog of national disasters, it can be understood as a justification of Israel's need for monarchy. And we understand that this image of a successful woman is sadly a way of condemning Israel with faint praise. But we're going to find ideas that are far more positive and powerful for us moderns in her tale. As we move ahead, I want you to keep a few historical facts at the forefront of your minds. First, this is the 12th century BCE that transitioned from the Bronze Age into the technologically superior Iron Age. Two, this story concerns Israelite tribes in the central region of Israel, Benjamin just north of Judea, in a region with no overarching Israelite control. This was a region dominated by Canaanite city-states and under the general loose rule of Egypt. Three, and this is really important, this is an agrarian society. Every person lived close to the thin, not very fertile soil and the vast night sky. And this is a central point in understanding our theme of how Deborah's leadership fused prophecy and wisdom in guarding our ancestors and protecting our land. Now, there are two distinct sections of the Deborah story. First, there's the narrative in chapter 4, the prose story part, and then the heroic song, the Shirah, of chapter 5. And I'll be referring to them separately. The biblical text doesn't give us a single coherent account of the story, so we actually have to piece together not only a picture of Deborah's wisdom, but even a complete account of the battle, together from diverse statements and hints across the narrative and Deborah's song. So the narrative starts by telling us that, in fact, Shira, why don't you go ahead and turn to the next slide, please? Great. It says, Deborah isha neviya eshet lapidot hi shofta et Yisrael be'et hahi. Deborah, the wife of Lapidot, was a prophetess. She led Israel at that time. Now, what do we know about Deborah? We're told almost nothing here, but there are certain things that we can deduce through a very close reading of the text. Now, the text uses the phrase eshet lapidot, which in the norms of biblical usage unquestionably means the wife of someone named Lapidot. Now, Lapidot's name never turns up again, and we also learned that she holds court under a palm tree. We soon learn that she's an influential enough personality that her general, Barak, won't even think of going to war against the Canaanites without her personal involvement. So we can't be certain about who her husband is, but through a linguistic relationship between the word lapidot, which means wicks or torches, and the word barak, lightning, the rabbinic tradition and some modern commentators accept that her husband, lapidot, and her general, Barak, are one and the same man. We're told nothing about her in connection with wealth or motherhood or landholding or success at farming, so her fame can't have anything to do with all that stuff. We aren't told that she is some distant oracle, but that people regularly come to her to settle their grievances. She literally held court at a well-understood spot, the Palm of Deborah in the hill country of Ephraim. We don't know how old she is, but she's evidently not tethered by small children, and she can ride off to war. So it's pretty fair to assume that she's in sort of a healthy, active middle age. I like that idea. In fact, in the Shirah, she describes herself as a mother in Israel. But since we're told nothing about children, we understand this in the light of an Assyrian myth in which the goddess Ishtar leads a king and his people out to battle wrapped in her lovely baby sling. She's also clearly closely connected to her community. Definitely not some old crone hidden away in a mountaintop shrine like, say, Greek oracles. We're going to look much more closely at the source of her reputation in a moment. But for now, Israel's in extremis. The nation, we're told, has been disobeying divine law. The Almighty has withdrawn his protective, outstretched arm for the moment, and the hill tribes are suffering the depredations of Sisera, a general working for Yavin, the king of Chatzor. Chatzor is the mightiest of the Canaanite city-states, so the storyteller describes Yavin as king of Canaan. Now, given that at this period, Israel's tribes lived in agricultural settlements in the hills, with their fragile, frequently arid farm and herding lands, while the Canaanites below controlled the trade routes, the roads, we can deduce that Sisera and his troops preyed upon the Israeli fields and flocks, disrupting their all-important trade routes and probably destroying crops as well. At right, we see the view from a still secure Israeli home. So let's keep, again, the era in mind. Again, iron is just beginning to replace bronze in weaponry. And the text tells us that Sisera had 900 iron chariots. At left, we see Sisera crushing a freshly planted field with his own heavy chariot. We understand that these subsistence farmers and herders, who would have nothing but scythes, sickles, and daggers, probably with more donkeys than horses, are facing a heavyweight professional army and cavalry. But for the moment, this Israelite home on the right is still intact. This is a good moment to point your attention to the pottery jars in the foreground. Now, any of you who have been to museums of biblical archaeology are familiar with the tall clay jars and amphorae that were used all over the Mediterranean for millennia to store everything from grain to olive oil to documents. And you may remember that the Dead Sea Scrolls, more than 1,000 years after the events here, were stored in clay jars. You may also remember that Lurianic Kabbalah revolves around the notion that in the creation of the world, the shattering of a fragile vessel filled with primordial divine light signaled the introduction of evil into the world. Now, I'm not working directly with Kabbalah here, as I do in my in my Kabbalah Shabbat book, but in this work, I do adapt the image of the vessel, the clay jar, to indicate Israel's overall mood at the given point in the story. If the vessel, so keep an eye out for those vessels. If the vessel is whole, life is good. If it's cracked or broken, there's trouble about. And so while this home is yet safe, its residents undoubtedly fear destruction, and the jars you see here have just begun to crack. Riding toward an Israelite village during the cool of dusk, a traveler might have startled at the red glow on the hillsides. And if you look at the paint, if you look underneath the Hebrew word on the right, you'll see the hillside smoldering after the day's Canaanite raid. Arcing across the unsettled night sky, though, is the limitless cosmos, its innumerable stars reminding the viewer of the divine promise to Abraham to make his descendants as innumerable as the lights of the heavens. And you're going to see the special role that the stars play here in just a few minutes. Next slide, please, Shira. Thanks. Perfect. Okay. So the people come to Deborah for guidance. Again, we're told she's a prophet, and it's clear that the people trust her. So that the general Barak says the people wouldn't follow him to war without her alongside. So let's look for a moment at what this prophet characterization for a woman means at the time. Archaeologist Carol Myers, in her 2011 book, Rediscovering Eve, explores the lives and roles of women in early Israel based on both the archaeological record on the archaeological record, and she describes what was probably a professional class of prophets in which women probably played a prominent role. Miriam, Deborah, Huldah, and Noadiah. This last one, Noadiah, is mentioned only once, much, much later, as an opponent to Nehemiah's plan to build new walls for Yerushalayim. And these four were, she suggests, just the tip of the iceberg. She suggests that most Israelite prophets, like those elsewhere in the ancient Near East, were professional prognosticators rather than spokespersons for the divine will, and that they used a variety of divination techniques, essentially consulting for clients with a problem, not unlike Joseph's dream interpretation for Pharaoh. So here, it's pretty fair to assume that this is Deborah's role here. She may well have won a reputation for pointing the way to previous successful actions and must have resolved popular disputes fairly. And this is the basis of the reason that she's elevated to the role of a shofet. Now, given that the Shirah, which dates back to the period of the biblical events themselves, much, much earlier than the narrative, absolutely does attribute the victory to God's intervention on behalf of Israel. We see that in this case, at least after the fact, Deborah presented her prognostication, her success, as a prediction of God's will, and presumably a later redactor didn't argue with her. At right, in this painting, we see her considering the claims of the wildly upset Israelites who visit her complete with flocks and children. The Midrash compares her to a strong house, so I show her in front of her own stone home, the doorway flanked by her famous palm, the torch symbolizing her husband, and in Midrash, certain aspects of her own merit, and a potted pink lily. There's a famous Midrash about the giving of the Torah that compares a fragrant rose-colored lily growing in a ruined orchard to the value of the 10 Commandments in a corrupted human world. So here, the lily beside the house alludes to the covenantal law by which Deborah guides her people. You can see the broken jar spilling wine and the clouded sky, not to mention the obviously upset villagers. And all of that indicates that trouble's afoot. All in all, Deborah is probably respected and followed because of her fair judgment to disputes and her skill at predicting the outcomes of daily troubles. And in just a few minutes, we'll see how this prognostication relates to the welfare of the land and why she's a necessary participant in the battle with Yavin. Now at left, we see Deborah and Barak leading the tribal army off to battle. Deborah has sent for her general, again, probably her husband Barak, and told him that God has commanded her to tell him to bring troops from the tribes of Naphtali and Zvulun to Nachal Kishon, the banks of the stream of Kishon near Mount Tabor, near Har Tabor, where they will conquer Sisera. Although Sisera himself would be delivered into the hands of a woman. Barak comes, but refuses to take on Sisera unless Deborah herself comes, for it's only she whom the tribes will follow. She has again shown skill at predicting events and interpreting God's intent. So at the same time that he realizes that only she commands the people's trust, he can also trust in her ability to predict the most reliable battle strategy. But for the moment, on that painting at the left, notice the cloudy gray sky and the dust that envelops the Israelites as they march through the dry soil. So here we see Deborah and Barak leading their men to battle, armed with little more than sickle swords. Accounts of war so often talk about clouds of dust raised by soldiers' march, and we can imagine the anxiety of these farmers and shepherds as they choke their way through the dust of their bare fields on the way to take on forces that they could only have found wildly intimidating. Now, I've composed this scene in a manner reminiscent of Egyptian and Mesopotamian battle friezes that often show different aspects of the events in 2 or 3 registers or rows of illustrations. So let's see what happens. Next slide, please. Cool, very good. Okay, the battle. Now, we all know what's going to happen, but actually figuring it out from the text takes some very, very careful reading and piecing together of that narrative in chapter 4 with the victory song, the Shirah, in chapter 5. So let's figure out what knowledge, what skill Deborah draws upon to predict a strategy. And these, in fact, are where our Tu B'Shvat theme of care for, of knowledge for the land will come in. This woman leader lives close to the land in this fragile agricultural environment that is utterly dependent upon the rains. Now, the narrative in chapter 4 doesn't mention this, but it becomes clear in the victory song that Deborah's strategy rests in her skill at understanding the land and the rains. And even with that knowledge, she takes a gamble. The forces meet at the bank of Nahal Kishon, the ordinarily dry riverbed of the Kishon River, and here's Deborah's strategy, her prediction, and her gamble. God, she says, has told her to lead the troops there, and that they'll prevail. And somehow, her far inferior force is going to smash that mighty Canaanite army. Her knowledge of the annual weather cycles, her ability to foresee and imagine skirmish and predicted rain, and a lot of guts led her to this brilliantly simple strategy. Her opponent, Sisera, must be assuming that the weather is dry, or there's no way on earth that he would have taken his 900 iron chariots anywhere near a stream bank. I'm sure the Deborah is hoping for rain that will swamp those heavy chariots, but not her own light and nimble troops, while Sisera, who remember must know this land very well, blithely figures that his strong forces can simply mow down those pesky farmers. So it would seem that this story must take place at the very beginning of winter, when the rains might or might not have begun. Both leaders can assume that they have an advantage. And Deborah's strategy works. As she expected, although the narrative doesn't mention this, the rains do start. We'll in fact see soon that in the much earlier Shirah, all the forces of nature join in. Sisera's chariots get mired in the mud. His soldiers, armed with long-distance weapons like spears and bows and arrows, are close to helpless. And those Israelite foot soldiers, those farmers with sickles, can run in and pick them off. It's worth remembering here that, as the late biblical scholar Tikva Frimer-Kensky noted, that later in Tanakh, Eliyahu and the prophets of Baal reenact a similar competition for control of the rain. Israel, she wrote, cannot ignore a central claim of Canaanite religion, that Baal is master of rain and thunderstorm. In this hill country that could not be irrigated by the Jordan, Israelite religion had to match the claims of Baalism in order to rival and supplant it. And that's just what happens. At right, we see the chaos of the battle. Now, soldiers have always described the experience of battle as an altered reality. We all talk about seeing red when we're angry, and that's what I've painted here. Archaeologically correct swords, spears, bows and arrows, battle horses, and chariots and sickles crash together in a wild, vicious melee. Let's think about the soldiers' emotions for just a moment. Deborah and Barak's troops probably weren't the first, and they definitely weren't the last soldiers to experience the chaos and altered consciousness of battle. Soldiers and poets of war from Homer on have always described altered states during battle. Let me offer you something very contemporary. Here's the Iraq war soldier and poet Brian Turner. This is a poem from a poem called 2,000 Pounds from his 2005 collection of war poetry, Here Bullet. Sergeant Ledoux of the National Guard speaks but cannot hear the words coming out, and it's just as well his eardrums ruptured because it lends the world a certain calm. Though the traffic circle is filled with people running in panic, their legs a blur like horses in a carousel, turning and turning the way tires spin on Humvee flipped to its side. Now, despite the Israelites' faith in Deborah's predictions, you can imagine their disorientation and fear, and also the bloodlust as they face the charging Canaanite charioteers. So, look to the left. Sisera escapes the route, and he runs off. Thirsty, hungry, probably trembling with exhaustion and anger and fear, he finds a Bedouin encampment and begs for water. Now, this is not just any Bedouin camp. This is the tent of Hever HaKeni, Hever the Canaanite, and his wife Yael. So why is the Canaanite designation important here? The rabbinics tell us that Cain's descendants, yes, this is Adam's son Cain, his descendants still worshiped God, although they didn't follow Israel's law. They're not idolaters. So acting on a loose alliance with the Israelites that the narratives told us about, Yael invites Sisera into her tent to rest. And instead of just water, she gives him a flask of milk to drink. It's worth noting now, sadly, that the rabbis use this moment as an occasion to reflect on the treachery of women. One of the few midrashic sources on the Deborah story, Pseudo-Philo, who wrote in 1st century CE Babylonia, actually Babylonia, Israel, or Rome, he described how Yael seduced Sisera with beauty, jewels, and perfume, and of course, choice food, offering him the milk in a princely bowl. When Yael saw him approach, she went to meet him arrayed in rich garments and jewels. She was unusually beautiful, and her voice the most seductive ever a woman possessed. These are the words she addressed to him. Enter and refresh thyself with food, and sleep until evening, and then I will send my attendants with thee to accompany thee, for I know thou wilt not forget me, and my recompense will not fail. When Sisera, on stepping into her tent, saw the bed strewn with roses which Yael had prepared for him, he resolved to take her home to his mother as his wife, as soon as the safety could be assured. Now, Pseudo-Philo's Yael sounds a whole lot more like a Roman courtesan than like a Bedouin wife. Although we know who the villain really is here, it's masculine fear of the femme fatale that we expressed so lasciviously here, with even a touch of empathy for Sisera rather than gratitude for this woman's courage, whether specifically in Israel's interests or in self-defense. Oh, wait a minute. Did I say self-defense? The narrative and the Shirah diverge sharply here. Each infers a slightly different version of what happened in Yael's tent. The narrative tells us that once Sisera fell asleep, Yael stealthily picked up a long, sharp tent peg, and using a mallet that she also grabbed, nailed it through Sisera's head, and he died. ותיקח יעל אשת חבר את יתד האוהל, ותשם את המקבת בידה, ותבוא אליו בלט, ותתקע את היתד ברקתו, ותצנח בארץ, והוא נרדם, ויעף וימות. Then Yael, the wife of Hever, took a tent pin and grasped the mallet. When he was fast asleep from exhaustion, she approached him stealthily and drove the pin through his temple till it went down to the ground. Thus he died. So that's the narrative. That's chapter 4. And that's what we tend to think about these days. The Shirah. Now remember, this is the far earlier text that's almost certainly contemporary with the battle itself. The Shirah says something different. Bein ragleha kara nafal shachav. Bein ragleha kara nafal be'asher. Kara sham nafal shadud. Between her feet, he sank, lay still. Where he sank, there he lay destroyed. Now, the Bible scholar Diane Sharon, who is just finishing JPS's commentary volume on Shoftim, walked through the choreography of Yael's attack described in the Shira while teaching a class some years ago. And she realized that this text only makes sense if we understand that Sisera was already asleep and he must have awakened and attempted to rape Yael. If she'd attacked him while he slept, of course, there would have been no place for him to have fallen to. Diane understands that the song implies that Sisera attempted to rape Yael, maybe after waking up from a good sleep. The author or redactor of the narrative, though, clearly intended Yael's act to be seen as an unexpected and heroic defense of Israel. And so the narrative has her initiating the attack on Israel's enemy. The rabbis consider the possibility that Yael had relations with Sisera, and not necessarily rape, but generally they attempt to reconcile the two accounts by saying that he fell down asleep before she took up the hammer and peg. Next slide, please. Great. Okay, so after the chaos of the battle, Deborah's leadership and Yael's individual courage, the narrative tells us that Deborah's prophecy has been fulfilled. Look to the illumination on the right. Israel has achieved peace. The tribal armies are free to return to their herding, farming, and trading unmolested. The sprig of caper plant that you see sticking out on the left draws upon a short discussion in the Babylonian Talmud that compares several plants and animals to various qualities of Israel. The Talmudic rabbis compare the scrubby plant that today springs from the stones of the Kotel and vadis like Ein Gedi, and despite scarce water and almost no available nutrients, can put out a fresh bud and a fresh blossom every day. They compare this to Israel's quality of perseverance with only faith in God to support us. The eagle feathers embracing the calm scene remind us that the God who brought Israel through the Red Sea as though on wings of eagles is the caring parent who sees his people through these trials. And now for something completely different. Look left. As the narrative ends, Shirat Deborah, Deborah's epic song, begins. Deborah sings of how when people completely devote themselves to God, God responds to them with all the forces of nature, and that mighty Canaanite army better watch out. Eretz Rashab gam shamayim natafu gam avim natfu mayim. The earth trembled, the heavens dripped, the clouds dripped water. And here we have one of Israel's great water victories, and so great water miracles and victories. And so it was matched with Beshalach as its Haftarah. In these paintings, I've attempted to portray, see, that's a great idea. In these paintings, I've attempted to portray the glorious chaos of battles that Deborah describes and the way she creates her own legend in the Shira. So in this first illumination of the epic at the left here, we see at the top the cloudburst that floods Nahal Kishon, which is ordinarily only a wadi, and the licking, grabbing tentacles of its waters run throughout these pages. Earth quakes and cracks in the face of the divine power evident in the flood. And an eagle flies overhead, that golden eagle, again drawing upon the image of God rescuing Israel as though on wings of eagles, al kanfei nesharim, in Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea in Exodus. A fortified wall crumbles in the waves as a Canaanite statuette of a god or a king and weaponry are sucked underneath. Next slide, please. Next one. Oh, here we are. That's right. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Uri, Uri, Dvara. Uri, Uri, Dabri, Shir. Awake, awake, Dvara. The chieftain and judge cries out. Awake, awake, strike up the chant. In this epic, Deborah addresses not her community directly, but herself. She tells herself to mark these deeds in song, and she creates her own legend that, of course, still reverberates today. I'm interested in the interplay between the kernels of human experience and legend in the poem, and I try to express this by painting parts of the poem like a masonry frieze. The frieze here on Illumination 9 is on the right is adapted from an Egyptian relief depicting the roughly contemporary 13th century Battle of Kadesh, in which Ramses II fought Hittite force. In the lowest register, though, I show peaceful trading, while at top, the sculpture of Deborah, you can see it right there, juts out of legend into reality. On Illumination 10 at the left, we again see Deborah exhorting the Israelite tribes to action as the Canaanite soldiers, chariots, and flailing horses' hoofs sink beneath the waves. Now, we've got to say something about those stars that you can see shooting overhead. One of the striking things here is that while the narrative just briefly describes the charge, there we go, the song evokes a dynamic image of all the forces of nature conspiring to win the day for the Israelites. The clouds drip and pour, the general's name means lightning, the earth shakes, the stream floods, and then in verse 20, Min shamayim nilchamu hakochavim, mim silotam nilchamu im Sisra. The stars fought from heaven, from their courses, they fought against Sisera. Now, my instincts left from 30 years of marriage to an astrophysicist prevent me from leaving that juicy little line alone. Now, how could the distant stars appear to fight? To me, this sounds like a meteor shower. Now, if you've ever lain outside in a desert or in a meadow or on the hood of a car in the middle of the California desert, or in the middle of the Sinai on a camping trip to watch a meteor shower, you know how bizarre and extraordinary it is to watch streaks of light unpredictably shooting overhead. And I remembered that the Leonid meteor shower occurs just at the beginning of winter each year, which in Israel is also the beginning of the rainy season. So I double-checked with an astronomer colleague of my late first husband's, and he agreed that it's just possible that if this battle did happen, and if it was during early winter, this verse could very well be describing the Leonids seeming to come to Israel's aid. So this detail sounds to me like a confirmation of the timing of this battle, of Deborah's genius at predicting the right moment for her gamble, the beginning of the winter rains. Next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Now these pages present the end of the Shirah, the end of the Deborah story. At right, we see the epic's view of not the simple skin of milk as in the narrative, but the lordly cup that Yael offered Sisera as he has fallen at her feet. The poem ends with a sardonic, blackly humorous image of Sisera's mother waiting at her window for him to come home, laden with booty, such as wonderful embroidered cloth and slave girls for every man. This is not a sweet motherly image. She's incredibly vulgar. They must be dividing the spoil that they found, a girl or two for each man, spoil of dyed cloths for Sisera, spoil of embroidered cloth round every neck as spoil. Now, the word she uses for the slave girls is not girl. Instead, she says, racham rachmatayim, wombs and wombs. And you might be able to imagine the debasing slang English term that this phrase probably resembled. These girls would be nothing more than spoil of war, and that's just fine with her. I imagine Sisera's mother as a shrill, spidery creature crouched behind, whoops, can we go back up? Yeah, if we can center that a bit. Perfect, okay. Crouched behind her window screen as the embroidery she imagines pours down from her sill. There's just a hint of the side of one of the imagined slaves at the bottom, next to the images of her son's real achievement, chariots and shields stuck in the mud of the miraculously flooded stream, whose waters still lick around the ruins. Sisera's vicious mother is a foil for the virtue and bravery of both Deborah and Yael. Deborah, of course, describes herself as a mother in Israel, as we saw earlier, a figure of national nurturing and care in line with heroic women and goddess figures in the nearby Mesopotamian culture. Sisera's mother is simply ugly, and for all her harsh bluster, all her bloviating, she doesn't know that her son, Israel's enemy, is already dead, ignominiously felled by the hand of another woman. Sisera's mother is the very antithesis of the wise woman whose knowledge of her environment, whose prophecy and leadership can bring victory. At left, we see the end of the Shirah. Deborah's and the Israel's solid walls reach upward, and the clay jars storing their crops rest safely within. The eagle, again symbolizing God's protection of Israel, flies upward. The mosaic painting depicts the sun rising behind Mount Tabor. Notice, though, that the scene is illuminated not by a natural sun, but by the man-made mosaic image of the sun, just as our tradition has been illuminated ever since, not simply by the historical events of the story, but by the human creation, the legend Deborah wove around her deeds. Now, I'd like to end by relating Deborah to the Eshet Chayil we sing about as we sit down to Shabbat dinner. Deborah's prophecy, as we've seen, lies in her ability to understand the world around her. Now, the biblical text describes her as Neviah, as a prophet, but it doesn't use the term wisdom. But if we correctly understand the broader biblical meaning of wisdom, I think we can very well relate to her as a figure of wisdom. Let's look for just a moment at what the term wisdom means in biblical contexts. Now, first use of the term wisdom, chokhmah. Note that it's the feminine form, chokhmah, instead of the masculine form, chacham, in Tanakh, occurs in the latter part, of Breshit, Genesis, when Pharaoh searches for a man of wisdom, discernment, navon v'chacham, to interpret his disturbing dreams. And he's then told about Joseph, who's languishing away in prison. The wisdom with which Joseph analyzes the dreams involves psychology and prophecy, which he then puts to use with solid agricultural and business management skills. He's also prognosticating, though. Move to the next book, Shemot, Exodus, and we see Moses appoint the human designer for the Mishkan, Bezalel, who is endowed with a divine spirit of skill, chacham lev, ability, and knowledge in every kind of craft and so on. Now, tellingly, the translators of that passage, that was from the JPS translation of 1985, they interpret chacham lev, literally a wise heart, as a spirit of skill. For this kind of wisdom resides in the talents to design, make, build, and manage material objects, sacred but material nonetheless in the terrestrial world. God soon provides directions for the structure and the decorations for the Mishkan, but it's Bezalel who fills in the details and implements those instructions, designs and directs the manufacture, the textiles and the aron and the golden almond blossoms on the menorah and so on, with his own God-given intelligence and skills. Deborah has used her skills and knowledge in precisely the same way to guide her people in this chaotic age. Now, by the time we get to the much, much later book of Proverbs, Mishlei, wisdom, not chacham, but as I mentioned before, the feminine form of chokhmah, is personified as a woman, God's companion since before creation. Let me read you this passage from Proverbs 8. It's absolutely key in understanding the role of wisdom. The Lord created me at the beginning of his course, as the first of his works of old. In the distant past I was fashioned, at the beginning, at the origin of the earth. There was still no deep when I was brought forth, no springs rich in water. Again, notice the water imagery. Before the foundation of the mountains were sunk, before the hills I was born. When he fixed the foundation of the earth, and I'm going to jump ahead now, I was with him as a confidant, a source of delight every day, rejoicing before him at all times, rejoicing in his inhabited world, finding delight with humankind. So again, we have those water references. Water essential to life on land is all important through Israel's culture and religion. And this woman wisdom becomes the Shekhinah of Kabbalah, the divine emanation that funnels all divine energy into the human world. Next slide, please. There we go. Okay. So this woman wisdom, the Shekhinah, is the Eshet Chayil that we sing of at our Shabbat tables. I'm showing you now my paintings of Eshet Chayil from my most recent book, Kabbalat Shabbat, The Grand Unification. The paintings present a complex visual allegory of wisdom in the guise of woman. The piyut itself, which is the last verses of Mishle in Proverbs 31, verses 10 to 31, presents an image of a woman who excels not only in moral character and all the abstracts we consider today as wisdom, but also in her worldly activities in the material world. And it's this woman that the Lurianic tradition likened to the female wisdom of Proverbs 8 and used to praise wisdom's contribution to the Shabbat home. And I would suggest that as we consider Deborah as a wise woman, as we understand her in her context of her appreciation of the natural world we celebrate on Tu B'Shvat, and her ability to translate that appreciation and knowledge into concrete leadership and action in the human world. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Okay. So thank you very much, and I'll be very happy to take questions. I hope you've enjoyed.
Okay. Okay. Hi. Sorry, I had muted myself.
Okay.
Let's bring myself back to. Here I am. Hi.
Hello. Hello.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
I hope you enjoyed. It's great.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the way that I feel like you were able to bring together a lot of pieces of what you often do in your work. There, the pieces from at the end there with Shabbat and wisdom and an Eshet Chayil, which is work you've done in other places. And also, I mean, this is part of the reason why we love working with you. So much of your work is so inherently feminist and so focused on women's empowerment. And I think I may have said this last time, but what's great about it is that you're really just looking at the texts, right? You're looking at of our tradition and what's already there. And it's
that's where I start.
Right. And that all you need to do is engage with texts that are already there, and we can see how much there is about strong female characters.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating to me that the rabbis of the Talmudic Mishnah, Talmudic periods are very disparaging of Deborah simply because they're scared of a strong woman. And it's clear, it's not more complicated than that. Because she's stellar of the whole period of Shoftim, she is the only leader who succeeds and succeeds brilliantly at that. Mm-hmm. It's really remarkable.
At a man's game, right?
At a man's game. And she is working with nothing but her own skills. She's calling it prophecy, saying it comes from God. The rains do start, but she's working with her own cleverness and knowledge of her people, knowledge of the land, and a lot of guts.
Right. And that it's not, it also seems significant to me that she's not a lone figure in the story, that there are so many other significant female characters, even, especially Yael, who who's presenting different strengths. And to a certain extent, Sisera's mother too, right? She's also a prominent female character.
Absolutely. She's clearly she's the general's mother. She's clearly considered influential enough that she's worth mentioning. Right. But she's the foil.
Right.
Because there is nothing to empathize with in this woman. She loses that. So I can't get sentimental about Sisera. So.
Of course. But I think for me that what I appreciate so much is that it's important for us to bear in mind that these things are we're not fabricating them. They're parts of our tradition, and sometimes they might be fewer than and far between than stories of male heroes, but they exist and they're there, and it's important for us to sort of salvage those moments and use those as
absolutely
models for female leadership when we can.
It's also very helpful to understand women's lives in the context of the archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you couldn't just look at the biblical text alone and the midrash alone and really get this. You need to understand something about the lives of the people on the land. The hills were not milk and honey. It was a tough, hard scrabble life, and very, very fragile. And you have to appreciate that to know how crucial the problem with the Canaanites was. And you have to understand the archaeology and the role of women in their communities to really get at Deborah's whole significance. So it's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's wonderful.
But most of it's right there in the biblical text. It's fascinating with a close, dispassionate reading.
Yeah, exactly. So I since we're talking so much about the text and opportunities to focus on text, I'll use this this moment also to let our viewers know that that Deborah has been generous enough to offer a 20% discount on all versions of Arise, Arise, Deborah, Ruth, and Hannah. And just to use that's 20% off, and you can use the discount code JOFA at checkout. And the link to follow is just to go to ipgbook.com. Here, I can share my screen with everyone right now so that they can see what I'm looking at. But this is also information that we've put online, we've put on Facebook. And again, when we circulate this video again, we'll put it out there, but that's 20% off with the discount code JOFA for any version of Arise, Arise. And this is it's a great opportunity if you enjoyed what you saw on these slides and you'd like to be able to hold it in your hands and look up close. I did my best to zoom in where possible.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Do we have any questions?
No, I don't think so. We did not receive any submitted questions this time.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Lovely. Well, this has been wonderful fun.
Yeah, it was wonderful.
And go back and read the story and understand that much more about it, and enjoy.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Lovely. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.